Clara Mercer sat on the cracked vinyl chair in the attorney's waiting room, counting the coins in her palm for the third time. $2.47. That was what she had to her name, and she was trying very hard not to let the woman behind the reception desk see her fingers trembling. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed with a sound that felt like it was eating into her skull, and the small plastic bag of her daughter's cough medicine in her purse weighed more than it should have, because she already knew she could not afford the refill the pharmacist had written on the back of the bottle. Outside, the October wind was pushing wet leaves against the glass door of the law office, and every time the door rattled, Clara flinched, as if the world itself were trying to get in and ask her how she planned to survive the rest of the month. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She was 34 years old. She had a 7-year-old daughter named Poppy with asthma and a laugh that could turn a bad day into something worth keeping. She had $183 left on an eviction notice clock that had started ticking 19 days ago. She had no job because the diner had cut her shifts to zero after the owner's nephew came back from the army and needed something to do. And she had no car because the transmission had given up on a highway shoulder outside Millbrook 3 weeks earlier, and she had sold it for scrap to pay the electric bill. What she did have, apparently, was a grandfather she had not seen since she was 11 years old, and that grandfather, Elias Mercer, had died 8 months ago in a town she had never heard of, and for some reason she could not understand. His estate attorney had finally tracked her down. The letter had come on a Tuesday. It had said, "Please contact this office regarding the estate of Elias Mercer," and it had included a phone number. Clara had sat with that letter on her kitchen table for 2 days before she called, because she was afraid that calling would mean being told she owed somebody something, which was how every unexpected envelope seemed to end these days. When she had finally dialed, the woman on the other end had been kind, almost too kind, in the way people are when they know the person they are speaking to is already bent over and cannot take another blow. "Ms. Mercer," the woman had said, "we have your grandfather's final bequest to discuss. Can you come in on Friday?" Clara had said yes without asking what the bequest was, because hope, even stupid hope, is sometimes the only engine a person has left. Now it was Friday. She had walked the 3 miles to the bus stop because she did not have change for the fare, and she had ridden the bus using a transfer a stranger had handed her at the station, and she was here, in this office, with $2.47 and a daughter at home with Clara's neighbor Mrs. Alvarez, who had promised to watch Poppy for exactly 2 hours and not a minute more because she had her own grandchildren to pick up from school. Clara looked at the clock on the wall. She had 97 minutes to find out what her grandfather had left her, get back on a bus, walk 3 miles, and relieve a tired old woman of a coughing child. 97 minutes to find out whether she had a future or whether she had just wasted a bus transfer on another door closing in her face. The attorney's name was Mr. Thaddeus Granger, and when he finally opened the inner door and beckoned her in, Clara was struck first by how old he was, and second by how gentle his eyes were. He had to be 70 if he was a day, with a white mustache that drooped over his upper lip and wire-rimmed glasses that he kept pushing up the bridge of his nose with one crooked finger. His office smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper, and there was a framed photograph on his desk of a woman who was no longer living, Clara could tell, because of the way the photograph was angled so that he could see it from where he sat. He gestured for her to take the chair across from him, and she sat, and she folded her hands in her lap to hide the trembling, and she waited. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "I want to thank you for coming in. I know this has been a long time coming, and I want to apologize for that. Your grandfather passed in February, and it has taken us this long to locate you. He had very specific instructions, you see, and one of them was that we were to find his granddaughter, Clara, and no one else. No other relatives. He was quite insistent on that point." Clara nodded, because she did not trust her voice yet. Mr. Granger opened a manila folder on his desk and slid a single sheet of paper across to her. "This," he said, "is the inventory of your grandfather's estate. I should tell you before you look at it that Elias was, by the standards of the world you and I live in, a poor man. He had very little in the way of liquid assets. What he had, he spent over the last 30 years maintaining a piece of property in Hollow Creek, which is a small town about 200 miles from here. And that property is what he left to you." Clara looked down at the paper. It was a short list. A two-story wood-frame building at 17 Sycamore Lane, Hollow Creek. An attached parcel of land, 3/4 of an acre. One antique wooden sign bearing the words Mercer and Sons Apothecary, dated 1897. Personal effects including one writing desk, 3 trunks of unspecified contents, assorted furnishings, and one black cat named Soot, presumed deceased given time elapsed. She almost laughed at the last line. Presumed deceased given time elapsed. Her grandfather had included his cat in his will, and the lawyer had made note that the cat was probably gone. There is also, Mr. Granger said, and he cleared his throat in a way that suggested he was about to deliver the part he had been dreading, the matter of the liquid portion of the bequest. Your grandfather did leave a small cash amount, set aside specifically for your inheritance. It was held in a separate account from the property upkeep fund. Clara lifted her eyes. How much? She asked, and she hated the sound of her own voice because it was too thin, too hungry. Mr. Granger folded his hands on the desk. $25, he said. Ms. Mercer, your grandfather left you $25 in cash, the apothecary building, and the land it sits on. Clara stared at him. For a long moment, she could not make the numbers connect to anything real. $25. She had been expecting nothing, of course, and nothing would have been easier to accept, in a way, because nothing was just nothing. It was what she was used to. But $25 was a joke. $25 was the specific and pointed kind of amount that a person leaves in a will when they are trying to make a statement, and she could not fathom what statement her grandfather could have been making. She had not spoken to him since she was a child. She had barely known him. He had written her 3 or 4 letters over the years, when her mother was still alive, and then after her mother had died of the cancer that had also eaten through every savings account the family had ever had. The letters had stopped, or Clara had stopped receiving them. She was never sure which. She swallowed. And the building, she said. Is it worth anything? Mr. Granger's face took on the apologetic expression of a man who had been asked this question before and had no good answer. Ms. Mercer, he said, I have been managing your grandfather's affairs for 19 years. I visited that property once, about 4 years ago, when he had a minor fall and asked me to come check that the doors were locked. The apothecary has not operated as a business since 1962. Your grandfather lived in the upstairs rooms and used the ground floor for, well, I am not entirely sure what. Storage. Memory. The building is structurally sound, or it was 4 years ago, but the town of Hollow Creek is not what it once was. The main street is half empty. I would not be honest with you if I told you the property had significant market value. If you tried to sell it today, I think you might clear perhaps $8,000. And that is being generous. Possibly less. The taxes on it are modest, because the assessed value is low, but they are due in January. Clara closed her eyes. $8,000. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, more money than she had held in her hands at one time in the last 3 years. But $8,000 would not pay off her back rent and her utility debts and buy her a car to get to a job she did not have yet. $8,000 would delay the disaster by 4 months. 5 if she was careful, and then she would be back exactly where she was now, except with nothing left to sell. And that was assuming she could find a buyer, in a dying town 200 miles from here, for a building no one had wanted for 60 years. Mr. Granger was watching her. She opened her eyes, and she saw that his gentle eyes had not moved. He was waiting for her to crumble, she thought, and she would not give him that. Not in this office, not in front of this desk, not with Poppy at home waiting for her. She sat up straighter. Thank you, she said, for tracking me down. I know you did not have to go to that trouble. He smiled faintly. Your grandfather was a friend of mine, Ms. Mercer. I am glad to have finished what he asked. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small envelope, which he slid across the desk. Your $25, he said. And this, he set a heavy brass key beside the envelope, is the front door key to the apothecary. There is also, he added, after a moment, a letter. Your grandfather wrote it the year before he died, and he left instructions that it be given to you only when you took possession of the property. I have it here. Would you like to take it now, or would you prefer I read the terms to you first? Clara picked up the key. It was cold in her palm, heavier than she had expected, with a worn brass tag hanging from it that read simply front. There were scratches on the barrel that suggested it had been turned in its lock many thousands of times over the decades. I will take the letter, she said. All of it. Everything he left. Mr. Granger nodded, as if this was what he had hoped she would say, and he handed her a second envelope, this one thicker, sealed with a wax stamp that had cracked with age but still held. Your grandfather asked that you not open this until you were inside the building, he said. For what it is worth, I do not know what is in it. He kept his own counsel, your grandfather did. I have attached to it a small document with my contact information and the name of the local postmaster in Hollow Creek, a Mr. Edgar Poole, who has a spare key in case you lose yours. He is expecting you, whenever you choose to come. Clara put the envelope, the $25, and the key into her purse. She stood. She thanked Mr. Granger again, and when she walked out of the office into the wet October wind, she did not cry, not yet, because crying was a luxury she would allow herself later, in the dark, when Poppy was asleep. She walked to the bus stop. She rode back across town. She walked the 3 miles from the bus stop to her apartment building, and by the time she knocked on Mrs. Alvarez's door to collect Poppy, she had made a decision, though she could not yet have said what the decision was. She only knew that she had a key in her pocket and a letter she had not read, and $25, and somewhere, 200 miles away, a building that her grandfather had spent 30 years of his life protecting. Poppy came to the door with her cheeks pink from the heat of Mrs. Alvarez's radiator and her dark curls frizzing around her face. "Mama," she said, "Mrs. Alvarez let me have cinnamon toast." Clara bent down and scooped her daughter into her arms and held her for longer than the child was patient for. Mrs. Alvarez watched them from the doorway and said nothing, because Mrs. Alvarez was a woman who had survived 3 decades in this country with very little, and she knew the look of someone who had just come back from another piece of bad news. Finally, Clara straightened, thanked her, and took Poppy home. That night, after she had given Poppy her cough medicine and read her 2 chapters of the battered library book about a pony, and after Poppy had finally fallen asleep with her small fist curled under her chin, Clara sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of her and a chipped mug of hot water, because there was no tea left and no coffee either. The wax seal cracked under her thumb. The paper inside was thick and cream-colored, and the handwriting was spidery and careful, the handwriting of a man whose hands were not quite steady, but who had refused to let that stop him from being precise. "My dear Clara," the letter began, "by the time you read this, I will be gone, and you will have traveled to Hollow Creek, or you will be about to. I know I did not earn the right to ask anything of you. I know your mother and I had our troubles, and I know that after Margaret passed, I did not do what I should have done to be a grandfather to you. For that I ask no forgiveness, because forgiveness would be cheap to ask of you, and I have already asked too much. What I ask instead is your patience. Go to the building. Walk through it, room by room. The upstairs is where I lived, and you will find it shabby but clean, because a woman from town, her name is Hattie Wren, comes every other week to dust and to check the pipes. The downstairs is the apothecary, and it has been closed to customers for longer than you have been alive. Do not be discouraged by what you see in either place. The building is old, and I am old, and neither of us polishes up as well as we used to. What I want you to understand, Clara, is that my father and his father before him, and I, were keepers of this place. I do not mean that in any romantic sense. I mean that the apothecary, in its first decades, was something more than a shop. Your great-grandfather was a cautious man, and his caution saved many lives in this county, though the history books do not know his name. He kept records. He kept inventories. He kept certain items in places that were not visible to the casual eye, because he believed, as I came to believe, that the most important things are the things that outlast the people who protect them. When I pass, those things pass to you, because you are the last of us, and because I believe, though I have only watched you from a great distance, that you are of the kind of character that will know what to do. I ask one thing of you specifically. Before you sell the building, and I know you will need to, I am not a fool, please open the cabinet behind the front counter. It is a tall oak cabinet with a brass lock, and the key is hidden inside the grandfather clock in the upstairs hallway, behind the pendulum, taped to the back of the brass weight. Open that cabinet. Take out every drawer. Examine each drawer carefully. Do not skip the ones that look empty, because the drawers my father built were not always what they appeared to be. What you find is yours, and has been yours since the day you were born. I love you, Clara. I loved your mother, and I love her daughter, though I was too proud and too broken to ever say it properly. Your grandfather, Elias. Clara read the letter twice. Then she read it a third time. Then she set it down on the table, and she stared at the wall of her kitchen, where a water stain in the shape of a wrinkled hand had been spreading for 6 weeks, and she did the math in her head. A bus ticket to Hollow Creek was almost certainly more than $25. She did not know how much, but she knew it was more. She had no money. She had no way to get there, and even if she got there, she would have to find a way to stay for at least one night, which meant a room or a motel or a park bench. She had Poppy to consider, and Poppy could not be left behind for days on end, which meant Poppy would have to come too, which meant 2 bus fares and 2 bodies to feed. It was impossible. It was laughable. The idea of her, Clara Mercer, climbing onto a bus with her coughing daughter to chase a dead man's riddle in a dying town was so absurd that she actually did laugh. Once, a short dry sound, into the empty kitchen. And yet, she thought about the cabinet. She thought about the drawers. She thought about her great-grandfather, whose name she did not even know, keeping records and inventories and items in places not visible to the casual eye. She thought about the phrase that had snagged on her mind and would not let go. What you find is yours, and has been yours since the day you were born. She did not believe it. Of course she did not believe it. If there was anything of value in that building, her grandfather would have sold it himself, to eat, to pay his own taxes, to mend his own roof. Old men did not leave fortunes in cabinets for granddaughters they barely knew. That was the stuff of fairy tales, and Clara had learned by the age of 15 that fairy tales were a lie the world told poor children to keep them quiet. But she also thought this. She had $8,000 of potential value in a building she had not seen, and she had 19 days left before she was evicted, and she had no job, and no car, and a daughter with asthma who was sleeping in a room that the landlord had stopped heating properly last winter because he wanted her gone. She had no real options. The building was an option. It was a bad option, but it was hers, and nobody could take it from her until the taxes came due in January. If she sold it, she would have a few months of air, and in a few months anything could happen. A job, a break, a small miracle that she would recognize when it came. And if her grandfather had left something in that cabinet, something he had believed was worth the 30 years he had spent protecting the building, then she owed it to him, and to herself, and to Poppy to find out what it was before she signed the deed over to a stranger. She folded the letter. She slid it into the envelope. She took the $25 out of the first envelope and she counted it, for 5s and 5 ones, and she laid the bills out flat on the table and she looked at them for a long time. Then she went to the kitchen drawer where she kept the important papers, the ones she could not afford to lose, and she pulled out a small tin that had once held peppermints and now held everything of value she possessed. Inside was her mother's wedding ring, which was not gold but was dear to her anyway, and Poppy's birth certificate, and a silver locket that had been her grandmother's, the only piece of jewelry Clara had that might be worth something to a pawnshop. She weighed the locket in her palm. Her mother had given it to her the week before she died, and Clara had sworn to herself that she would never sell it, no matter how bad things got. She had sworn this to herself half a dozen times over the last 3 years. But the locket, she reminded herself now, was a thing, and Poppy was a person, and one of them was going to have to give way. She put the locket back in the tin. Not yet. Not tonight. She would go to the pawn shop in the morning, if she had to, but first she would call Mrs. Alvarez and ask if Poppy could stay with her for 3 days, and she would call the bus station and find out exactly what a ticket to Hollow Creek cost. And she would tell herself that none of this was real until it was real. One step at a time. That was the only way she had survived this long. She blew out the candle she had been reading by, because she was saving the last of the electricity for the space heater in Poppy's room, and she went to bed with her arms wrapped around her ribs to keep herself warm. She did not sleep well. She dreamed of wooden drawers opening endlessly, and of a tall black cabinet with a brass lock, and of her grandfather's voice, which she could no longer remember, telling her that what she found was hers, and had been hers since the day she was born. In the morning, she called the bus station. A one-way ticket to Hollow Creek was $39. A round trip was $62. She had 25. She called Mrs. Alvarez and asked about Poppy, and Mrs. Alvarez, bless her, said 3 days, Clara, no more, and I will make sure she takes her medicine. Clara thanked her and hung up and stood in her kitchen for a long time with the phone in her hand. And then she went to the bedroom and took the silver locket out of the tin, and she put it in her pocket, and she walked to the pawn shop on 7th Street with her head up and her eyes forward, because if she let herself think about what she was doing, she would turn around and go home. The man at the counter gave her $42 for the locket. He gave her a ticket stub and told her she had 90 days to buy it back. She nodded and took the money and walked out. And she did not cry until she was around the corner and out of sight. And even then she cried only for about 30 seconds, because she did not have time for more. $67. A round-trip ticket and $25 to eat and find shelter on the other end. It was enough, if she was careful. It was not enough, if anything went wrong. She would be careful, then. She bought the ticket for the next morning. She spent the afternoon packing a small duffel bag for herself and a backpack for Poppy, and she explained to Poppy, in the simplest words she could find, that they were going on an adventure to see a house that used to belong to her great-grandpa. Poppy's eyes got very big. "Is it a haunted house?" Poppy asked. Clara laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. "I do not think so, sweetheart," she said. "But we will find out together." They ate cheese and bread for dinner, because it was the last food in the apartment, and Clara did not tell Poppy that she had $43 in her pocket and that every cent of it was already spoken for. She was still awake at 1 in the morning when the phone rang. It was Mrs. Alvarez. "Clara," her neighbor said, and her voice had the tense, careful tone of a person trying not to alarm. "I am sorry to call so late, but my daughter just telephoned me from the hospital. My grandson has pneumonia. I have to drive down to see them in the morning. I cannot take Poppy. I am so sorry, Mija. I am so sorry." Clara stood in the dark kitchen with the phone against her ear, and she said the right things. "Of course, Mrs. Alvarez, go be with your family. I understand. Please do not worry about us." And she hung up, and she sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and her forehead on her knees, and she did the new math. She had a ticket she could not afford to waste. She had a daughter she could not leave alone. She had no one else to call, because her few friends had their own troubles, and she had stopped asking for help 2 years ago when she realized how quickly friendship wears thin under the weight of constant need. She had Poppy, and Poppy would have to come with her. 2 tickets, then. A child's fare was usually half, she thought, which would be about 20 more, and she had 43 in her pocket, which left 23 for food and shelter on the other end for 3 days. It was not possible. It was not even nearly possible. But she had already sold the locket and she could not get it back. And she had a key in her purse and a letter from a dead man. And some part of her, the stubborn part that her mother had given her along with the locket, refused to believe that she had come this far for nothing. She got up off the floor. She went to Poppy's room and looked at her daughter sleeping, with the stuffed elephant tucked under her chin and her small chest rising and falling. And she whispered, "We are going to be all right, baby. We are going to figure this out." And she believed it, in the particular way that a person in a burning house believes there is a door somewhere, not because she can see the door, but because the alternative is unthinkable. The bus to Hollow Creek left at 6:45 in the morning. Clara and Poppy were on it, with the duffel and the backpack and the cough medicine and a paper bag with 4 slices of bread and a jar of peanut butter and 2 apples, which was breakfast and lunch and possibly dinner, depending on how long the ride was. The driver looked at Poppy, looked at Clara, looked at the ticket, and did not charge her the full child's fare. He just nodded once and let them pass, and Clara did not say thank you because she was afraid if she opened her mouth she would cry. Poppy, for her part, was thrilled. She pressed her nose to the window and narrated the passing scenery with the confident inaccuracy of a 7-year-old, and by the time they had been on the road for an hour, she had named 3 cows, predicted the weather for the next week, and decided that when they got to the old house, she was going to name the cat that was probably dead. The ride took most of the day. The bus stopped in 6 small towns and 1 medium-sized one, and at every stop Poppy asked if this was Hollow Creek, and at every stop Clara said not yet. The countryside flattened and then grew hills, and the hills grew trees, and the trees grew thick and red and gold with the late autumn, and Clara watched the landscape change the way a person watches the shore recede from a ship. By the time the bus turned off the main highway and onto a narrower 2-lane road, the sun was already low, and Poppy had fallen asleep with her head on Clara's shoulder and her small hand curled into the sleeve of Clara's coat. Clara did not move. She barely breathed. She had not held this much stillness in months, and she wanted to remember it, because she suspected she was not going to have many more quiet hours for a while. The driver called out Hollow Creek at 4:22 in the afternoon. Clara woke Poppy gently and gathered their things, and they stepped off the bus onto a short main street that looked as if someone had photographed it in 1953 and then simply stopped updating the image. There was a post office, a feed store, a shuttered diner with a faded sign that said Millie's, a hardware store with its windows streaked white with dust, and a single traffic light that blinked yellow in all four directions. A thin, gray-haired man in a postal uniform was locking the door of the post office as Clara and Poppy approached, and when he saw them, he straightened and adjusted his cap and walked toward them, and Clara understood, from the way he looked at her, that this was Mr. Edgar Poole, and that he had been expecting her, and that news, in a town this small, had very few doors to get lost behind. "Ms. Mercer," he said, when he was close enough. His voice was dry and careful and kind. "I am Edgar Poole. I am very pleased to meet you. And this must be." He bent at the waist, slightly, not enough to be patronizing, but enough to speak to Poppy at her own level. "And what is your name, young lady?" "Poppy," she said, without shyness, because she had never in her life been afraid of grown-ups, which was a thing Clara had always envied. "I am Poppy Mercer, and I am 7, and my mama says we are going to a house that my great-grandpa used to live in." Mr. Poole straightened and smiled, a small, tight smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and Clara noticed it, and she filed it away. "Well, Miss Poppy," he said, "I believe you are correct. I also believe the two of you have had a long day and will be wanting some supper and a place to sleep before you tackle any old houses. Is that about the size of it?" Clara felt her face flush, because she did not want to be the kind of woman who arrived in a strange town with no plan and no money and was immediately an object of pity. But she also did not have the energy to pretend. "We were going to find a motel," she said. "If there is one." Mr. Poole nodded slowly. "There is one," he said. "The Lamplight, up on Route 4, about 3 miles north of here. It is not terrible, and it is not fancy. But I am not sure you want to walk it tonight with this young lady. And there are no taxis in Hollow Creek, Ms. Mercer, because there is not the custom for it." He paused, and he rubbed his jaw, and Clara watched him weigh something out in his head. And then he said, "My wife and I have a back room with 2 beds in it. It is nothing special. It was my son's room when he was a boy, but he is in Denver now, and it is just a room. You and your girl are welcome to it for the night, if you have no objection to strangers. There would be a supper involved, which my Martha has already started, as a matter of fact, because I told her about your arrival this morning. No charge. I want to make that clear before you try to refuse on account of money. Your grandfather was a friend of mine, Ms. Mercer. A quiet friend, but a friend. I would be obliged if you would let me do this small thing." Clara opened her mouth, and she closed it again. She had been raised to say no to charity, because charity was a debt you could not see, but that would come due eventually. And she had learned the hard way that you could not pay debts you did not have the currency for. But she looked at Poppy, who was tired, and she looked at Mr. Poole, who was a small man with a careful mustache and eyes that had no agenda she could read. And she thought about the $23 in her pocket and the 3 days ahead of her, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Poole. That is very kind of you. We would be grateful." He nodded once, as if that was settled, and he locked the post office and led them half a block down the street to a narrow 2-story house with green shutters and a yard that had been recently raked. His wife, Martha Poole, met them at the door, a round woman with a calico apron and flour on her hands and an expression that was no nonsense, but not unkind. She took one look at Poppy and said, "Child, come into the kitchen. I have sugar cookies cooling." And Poppy forgot to be shy or tired and went with her without a backward glance, and Clara was left standing in the front hall with her duffel bag at her feet, holding herself together by a single thread that had not snapped yet only because she had not let it. Mr. Poole put a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Sit down at that table, Ms. Mercer," he said. "Martha will feed you. We will talk about the building in the morning. You have had enough today." And for reasons she could not explain, Clara listened to him. She sat at the kitchen table. She ate stewed chicken and biscuits and green beans that had been put up in a jar last summer, and she drank 2 cups of strong coffee that Martha refilled without asking, and she answered questions about Poppy's school and about the bus ride, and about nothing more serious than that, because Martha Poole, Clara came to understand, was a woman who knew that exhausted people did not need to be interrogated, they needed to be fed. After supper, Poppy was half asleep at the table with a sugar cookie still clutched in her hand, and Martha showed them up to the back room. which had 2 narrow beds with quilts on them, and a single window that looked out on a backyard where a maple tree was dropping the last of its leaves. Clara tucked Poppy in, and Poppy was asleep within a minute, and Clara sat on the edge of the other bed for a long time without moving, listening to the quiet of a town where the nearest sound was a dog barking 3 streets over. She slept, eventually, harder than she had slept in months. She woke at 6, because her body had been waking at 6 for years, and she lay still and listened to the house. Someone was already up. She could hear the faint sound of a kettle, and the creak of floorboards, and the low murmur of a radio. She got up carefully so as not to wake Poppy, dressed, and went downstairs. Mr. Poole was at the kitchen table with a newspaper and a cup of coffee, and he poured her one without asking, and he said, "Good morning, Ms. Mercer." "Good morning," she said. He slid a plate of toast toward her. "I will walk you over to the building after breakfast," he said, "if that suits you. It is a 10-minute walk. Your little one can stay with Martha if you would like." Martha has already offered. She does not get much practice with small children anymore, and she is very pleased to have one in the house. Clara had not realized how much she had needed someone to take a decision off her shoulders until he did. "Yes," she said. "Thank you. That would help." They ate toast in companionable silence. Poppy came down in her pajamas 20 minutes later, sleepy and warm and asking for the cookies she had not finished, and Martha scooped her up and took her off to find hair ribbons, and Clara and Mr. Poole put on their coats and walked out into the bright, cold morning. And for the first time, Clara saw a hollow creek in proper daylight. It was a sad little town. There was no getting around it. Half the storefronts on the main street were vacant, their windows papered over with yellowed newspaper. The paint on the buildings had not been refreshed in a generation, and the brick had the darkened look of brick that had been breathing coal smoke for a century. A single tractor was parked at the curb outside the feed store, and a woman was sweeping the sidewalk in front of the hardware store, and that was all the human activity Clara could see. And yet there was something about the place, a quiet dignity, maybe, that she could not quite name. The houses were small, but most of them were cared for. The sidewalks were swept. The church steeple at the far end of the street was freshly painted white, and someone had planted chrysanthemums in the half-whiskey barrel planters along the curb. This was a town that was losing, but it had not yet agreed to lose. Sycamore Lane was a side street off the main road, 4 blocks from the post office. The Apothecary was the 3rd building in, on the left. Clara saw it before Mr. Poole had to point it out, and something in her chest tightened, because she recognized it, though she had never seen it before, and she realized after a moment that she recognized it from a photograph her mother had kept on the mantelpiece, a small black-and-white picture of a narrow brick storefront with a hand-painted sign above the door. She had looked at that photograph 100 times as a child without ever asking what it was, because her mother had never volunteered to tell her, and because Clara had learned early not to poke at the things her mother did not speak of. The building was 2 stories, built of narrow red brick that had gone brown with age. The front was flat except for a broad bay window to the right of the door, behind which Clara could see the faint silhouettes of shelves and bottles. The hand-painted sign over the door read, in an elegant Victorian script, "Mercer and Sons Apothecary, St. 1897, and below that, in smaller letters, "Prescriptions carefully prepared." The paint was cracked, but the letters were still legible. The door was heavy wood with a small oval of glass at the top, and the glass was clean, which surprised Clara, until she remembered that Hattie Wren, whoever she was, came every other week to dust. Mr. Poole had stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, and he made no move to come closer. "This is as far as I go, Ms. Mercer," he said. "Your grandfather was a private man, and I believe the first time through those doors should be yours alone, and your daughter's when she is ready. I will be at the post office. It is open until 5. If you need anything, or if you have any trouble at all, you come and find me." And he tipped his cap to her, and he walked away, and Clara stood on the sidewalk with the brass key warming slowly in her palm, and she looked up at the sign, and she said, under her breath, because she could not help herself, "All right, grandfather. Here I am." The key fit the lock, and the lock turned on the first try, which surprised her. The door swung inward with a low groan of hinges, and a wave of old air came out to meet her, air that smelled of dust and dried herbs, and something faintly sweet, like old honey, and something faintly sharp, like camphor. She stepped inside. The floor beneath her feet was dark wood. worn into a shallow depression in front of the counter where, she imagined, 120 years of customers had stood and waited for their prescriptions. She closed the door behind her, and the silence of the place settled around her shoulders like a shawl. She stood for a long time without moving, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness. Light came in through the bay window to her right, slanted in gold in the morning sun, and dust motes turned slowly in the beams. Along the walls were tall wooden shelves, reaching almost to the pressed tin ceiling, and on those shelves, in neat rows, were hundreds of small glass bottles, each one labeled in the same spidery handwriting she recognized now from her grandfather's letter. Some of the labels were faded past reading. Others she could still make out. Tincture of arnica, oil of peppermint, syrup of squill, elixir of gentian, laudanum, which she knew had been sold in apothecaries in her great-grandfather's time, but which she could not imagine having a legitimate use for 100 years later. She stepped closer to one of the shelves and touched the edge of it lightly, and the wood was smooth as river stone, smoothed by decades of hands. In the center of the room stood a long wooden counter, scarred by use, with a brass-plated cash register at one end that looked as if it had not been opened since the Eisenhower administration. Behind the counter, against the back wall, stood the cabinet her grandfather had mentioned in his letter. It was tall, taller than she had pictured, easily 8 feet high, made of dark oak that had been polished to a deep glow. It had 2 sets of doors, the upper set with narrow glass panels that showed shelves beyond them, and the lower set solid and closed. In the seam between the lower doors was a brass keyhole, small and ornate, polished bright against the dark wood. Clara's breath caught. She took a step toward the cabinet, and then she stopped, because her grandfather had said the key was upstairs, and she had to go upstairs first, and she did not want to rush this. She had waited 34 years to come into possession of something that was hers, and she was not going to open the cabinet in 10 minutes. Not when her grandfather had taken the trouble to hide the key in a place that required her to walk through his life first. There was a narrow door to the left of the counter, and a sign above it in the same Victorian script that read private. She opened it. Beyond was a narrow staircase leading up, the steps worn in the middle the way old wooden steps always are, and she climbed it slowly, with her hand on the banister, because she wanted to feel every worn board under her feet. The upstairs was an apartment. A small one, 3 rooms, with the same pressed tin ceilings as the shop below and tall narrow windows that looked out on the back garden and the roof of the building next door. The front room was a parlor of sorts, with a worn green velvet armchair facing a small fireplace that did not look as if it had been used in years, and a wooden rocker by the window, and a braided rug on the floor that was faded almost to gray. The middle room was a kitchen, small and dim, with a cast-iron stove that was polished and black and probably still worked, and a single deep sink, and a small round table with 2 chairs. The back room was a bedroom, with a narrow iron bed made up with a patchwork quilt that had been pieced, Clara could see, from scraps of a dozen different shirts and dresses, some of which she thought she half recognized from photographs of her grandmother. The hallway that connected the rooms was narrow, and at the end of it, between the parlor and the kitchen, stood the grandfather clock. It was as tall as she was, with a long glass front that showed the brass pendulum still and the weights hanging beside it, and a face painted with small pale flowers around the numerals. The hands had stopped at 10 minutes past 4. She did not know whether that was the time of his death, or just the time the clock had wound down, or some other time entirely, and she did not think she wanted to know yet. She opened the glass front. It creaked, because the hinge was old, and she felt along the back of the brass weight with her fingers. The key was there, small and cold, taped with a piece of cloth adhesive tape that had gone yellow but still held. She peeled it off carefully and held the key in her palm. It was no bigger than her thumbnail, ornate, with a looping curlicue for a handle. She closed her fingers around it, and she stood in the hallway of her grandfather's apartment for a long moment with her eyes shut, because she did not want to start crying yet, and she could feel the pressure building behind her eyes. She took a breath. She opened her eyes. She went downstairs. She walked to the oak cabinet behind the counter, and she slid the key into the little brass lock, and she turned it, and the lock clicked with the soft, precise sound of a mechanism that had been oiled and maintained for a very long time. She pulled open the lower doors. The inside of the cabinet was lined with drawers. Small drawers, dozens of them, each one labeled in the same careful hand as the bottles on the shelves. Senna, valerian, mandrake, powdered alum, gum arabic, comfrey root. The labels were on tiny brass plates screwed into the fronts of the drawers, and each drawer had a small brass pull in the shape of a leaf. Clara counted. There were 48 drawers in all, arranged in a grid 6 across and 8 down, and they filled the entire lower half of the cabinet. She stood with her hand on the pull of the topmost left-hand drawer, and she knew, without being able to explain how she knew, that whatever she found or did not find in these drawers was going to change her life, one way or the other. If there was nothing, or only old dried herbs and expired powders, then she would know, at least, that she had come, and that she had honored her grandfather's final request, and she would walk away with $25 and a building she could probably sell for a few $1,000s, and her life would continue on the track it had been on. If there was something, though, if her grandfather had meant what he wrote, then she did not know what came next. She did not know how to imagine it. She slid the first drawer open. The first drawer slid open smoothly, as if it had been opened often and recently, though Clara knew that could not be true. Inside was a small glass vial with a cork stopper and a folded slip of paper tucked beside it. The vial held a fine gray-green powder. The label on the drawer read Senna, but the label on the vial itself, in her grandfather's spidery hand, read something different. Receipt 1902, it said, and under that, a number. Clara unfolded the slip of paper. It was a piece of stiff cream cardstock, and written on it in faded brown ink was a notation in a hand that was older than her grandfather's, rounder and more careful, with the deliberate flourishes of a man who had learned to write in the 19th century. Mrs. Abraham Coulter, it read. 7 grains, 3 times daily. Paid in full with $1 silver, 1 laying hen, and 2 jars preserves. March the 4th, 1902. Clara read it twice. She turned the card over. On the back, in the same hand, was a single line. She will recover. So she did. Clara set the card down gently on the counter. Her hands were trembling, though she did not know yet why. She slid the drawer back into the cabinet and pulled open the second. Inside, another vial. Another folded card. Mr. Hollis Brown. Camphor rub for rheumatism. Paid in labor, 3 afternoons of stable work. January the 11th, 1904. She opened a third drawer. A fourth. A fifth. They were all the same. Each drawer held a small measure of the substance named on its brass label, and each drawer held a folded receipt, some dated from the 1890s, some from the 1920s, one from as late as 1961, and every receipt recorded not just a transaction, but an outcome. She will recover. He lived to see his granddaughter married. The infection went out. He passed that winter, but comfortable. The child was saved. It took Clara a moment to understand what she was looking at, because she had been braced to find money, or jewelry, or gold coins, or bonds, or any of the things a fairy tale might have put in a hidden cabinet. Instead, she was finding pieces of paper. She was finding receipts written by her great-grandfather and her grandfather after him, logging more than a half-century of small transactions in a small town, each one recording a name and a treatment and a price that was often not paid in cash. And at first her heart sank, because she thought this is what he meant. He meant the history. He meant the record of what the family had done. He meant something beautiful and worthless, and she had come 200 miles and spent her mother's locket to stand in a dusty shop and read the names of dead strangers. But she kept opening drawers, because she had told herself she would, because her grandfather had said, do not skip the ones that look empty, and she had not yet reached the empty ones. She worked through the top row, then the second, and she was halfway through the third row when her fingers closed on the pull of a drawer labeled Colchicum Automale, and she felt immediately that something was wrong with it. The drawer was heavier than the others, not by much, but by enough that her body noticed before her mind did. She pulled it open. Inside was the usual small vial of powder and the usual folded receipt. But when she lifted the vial out to hold it to the light, she could see, beneath where the vial had been sitting, that the floor of the drawer was not flush. There was a hairline seam running across the bottom of the drawer, about an inch in from the back, and when she pressed on the front of the drawer floor, nothing happened, but when she pressed on the back, the front tipped up slightly, just a hair, the way a shallow lid tips on a hidden hinge. Clara's breath went very still in her chest. She lifted the drawer clear out of the cabinet and set it on the counter. She took the vial out, and the receipt, and the little sheet of old felt that lined the bottom. Beneath the felt, the drawer floor was 2 pieces, not 1. The front piece was shorter, and the back edge of it was beveled so that it could be lifted out. She slid a fingernail into the seam. The wood was old, but it moved easily, as if it had been oiled, as if someone had opened this drawer the same way many, many times over the course of a long life. She lifted the false floor out. Underneath, nested in a bed of faded green silk, was a small velvet pouch. It was the color of a bruise, deep purple going black, and it was no bigger than her palm. It was closed with a silken drawstring, and it had weight. Not great weight, but a focused density, the way a pouch of coins has weight, or a pouch of stones. Clara stared at it for what felt like a very long time. Then she picked it up. The drawstring loosened easily. She tipped the contents into her cupped palm, and she heard herself make a sound, a small sharp inhalation, because what fell out was not what she had expected and not what she had allowed herself to hope for either. 8 small stones. Pale, slightly cloudy, rough on the outside, each one about the size of a pea or a little larger. They did not look like anything at first. They looked like pebbles a child might pick up from a creek bed. But there was something about the way the light caught them where they had been worn smooth that made Clara turn one over between her thumb and finger, and when she held it up to the slant of morning sun coming through the bay window, she saw, deep inside the cloudiness, a sudden flash of pure blue-white fire. She did not know, in that moment, what she was looking at. She only knew that the flash of light had been unlike any flash of light she had ever seen come out of a pebble. She folded the stones back into the pouch, her fingers shaking so badly that 2 of them dropped onto the counter before she could gather them up. She put the pouch in her coat pocket. She slid the false floor back into the drawer. She put the felt back, and the receipt, and the vial, and she slid the drawer back into the cabinet as if nothing had happened, because she did not yet know what was happening, and she did not trust herself to know. Then she sat down on the floor behind the counter, with her back against the base of the cabinet, and she pressed both hands over her face, and she did not cry. She laughed, instead, a single disbelieving laugh that came out of her almost like a sob, and then she went very quiet, because the math was already running in her head whether she wanted it to or not. 8 stones. She had no idea if they were what she thought they might be. She had no idea what they might be worth, if they were. But she knew, because her mother had raised her on fairy tales, and then on the absence of fairy tales, that a man did not hide 8 pebbles in a velvet pouch under a false-bottom drawer unless those pebbles were something worth hiding. She sat there for a long time, long enough that the sunbeam from the bay window moved across the floor by an inch. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about the receipts. She thought about the 48 drawers, and how she had opened perhaps 16, and how there were 32 more to go, and she thought, very clearly, I have to stop. I have to stop and think. Because if there was more in this cabinet, and she was beginning to suspect there was, then she was sitting in an empty storefront in a town she did not know with something that might be very valuable, and she was alone, and no one knew she was here except Edgar Poole and his wife, and she did not know yet whom to trust. She did not even know yet whom to ask for help. She got up off the floor. She smoothed her coat. She closed the cabinet doors, turned the tiny brass key, and put the key in her other pocket, opposite the pocket with the pouch. She walked through the shop one more time, slowly, as if memorizing it, which was what she was doing. The bottles on the shelves, the worn place in the floor, the brass cash register, the pressed tin ceiling, the bay window, the front door. She let herself out. She locked the front door behind her. She slid the heavy brass front key into her purse and zipped the pocket closed. She stood on the sidewalk and she took 3 slow breaths, and she told herself, you are going to walk to the post office. You are going to thank Mr. Poole for his kindness, and you are going to say nothing about any of this. Not yet. Not until you know more. And she was halfway back to Main Street when the first truck pulled up. It was a newer truck, a big one, the color of wet charcoal, with oversized tires and tinted windows, and it came to a stop at the curb in front of her with the kind of deliberate slowness that meant the driver wanted her to notice. She did notice. She stopped on the sidewalk. The passenger window rolled down, and a man leaned across the seat from the driver's side. He was in his 50s, heavy-set, wearing a barn coat and a camouflage cap, with the kind of weathered red face that came from drinking and weather in roughly equal measure. He smiled at her. and his smile was friendly. But it was the friendliness that people in small towns put on when they have something to say that is not friendly at all. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "I thought that might be you. Word is you came in on the bus last night. I am Roy Bascomb. I own the parcel out back of your grandfather's place. We were neighbors a long time, Elias and me. I am sorry for your loss." Clara nodded, because she did not know what else to do. "Thank you," she said. Mr. Bascomb's eyes did not leave her face. "I wanted to catch you before you got too settled," he said. "I have had an offer out on that building for 2 years now. I put it to Elias, and he would not hear it. But he was getting on, and he knew he was getting on, and I told him, 'Elias, when your girl inherits, you make sure she knows I am willing to talk.' Did he tell you about that?" Clara shook her head slowly. "He did not mention it," she said. Mr. Bascomb laughed, a short, loud laugh that did not have any real humor in it. "Well," he said, "he was a stubborn old goat. That was Elias. But the offer still stands, miss. I will give you $12,000, cash money, for the building and the lot. I will have the paperwork drawn up today if you want. You do not even have to pay the lawyer. I will pay him. You would walk out of Hollow Creek with more money than you came with, and you would not have to worry about taxes, repairs, any of that. That building is going to fall down in 5 years if somebody does not put $20,000 into it, and I do not think you are in a position to do that. No offense meant. Just speaking plain." He was speaking plain. Clara heard it. She also heard the $12,000, which was $4,000 more than Mr. Granger had told her she could get for the building, and which was, in the context of her life, an amount of money that would have sounded like deliverance yesterday morning. She felt the weight of the velvet pouch in her coat pocket. She felt the weight of Poppy, back at the Pools' house, eating a sugar cookie and unaware that the world she lived in was about to become one thing or another. "Mr. Bascomb," she said, and she was proud of how even her voice came out. "That is very generous, and I appreciate the offer. I only arrived last night. I have not had time to even look through the building properly, let alone make a decision. I would like to take a few days before I respond to any offer. I hope you understand." Mr. Bascomb's smile tightened by a fraction of a degree. "Of course," he said. "Take your time. But I will tell you this, miss, because nobody else in this town will tell you straight. Your grandfather was not well liked, toward the end. He got strange. He said strange things. He put up with people who should not have been put up with. There are things in that building that have been left alone a long time because nobody wanted to tangle with Elias Mercer, but he is gone now. And there are people in this town who would be very interested to know what you find in there, and not all of them are friendly. I am friendly. I am making you a friendly offer. You take your few days. But you think hard, Ms. Mercer. You have got that little girl to think about." He tipped his cap at her. The window rolled up. The truck pulled away from the curb and rolled slowly down the street, and Clara stood on the sidewalk and watched it go, and her hand was closed so tightly around the brass key in her pocket that she could feel the teeth biting into her palm. There are things in that building that have been left alone a long time. She walked back to the post office. She walked fast, faster than she meant to, and by the time she got there her breath was short and her cheeks were red from the cold, and Mr. Poole looked up from his desk and saw her face and stood up at once. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "what has happened? Are you all right?" Clara glanced around. There was no one else in the post office. She said, "Mr. Poole, may I ask you a question in confidence?" He gestured toward the back of the office, where there was a small door with a sign that said employees only, and he held it open for her, and he closed it behind them, and they were in a small back room with a table and 2 chairs and a large safe in the corner and a coffee pot on a hot plate that smelled as if it had been going since 5 in the morning. "A man named Roy Bascomb just stopped me on the street," Clara said. "He offered me $12,000 for the building. He said my grandfather was not well liked toward the end. He said there were things in the building that had been left alone because people were afraid of Elias." "What did he mean by that? I need to know. I need to know what I am walking into." Mr. Poole did not answer right away. He pulled out a chair and sat down in it slowly, and he gestured for Clara to do the same, and she did. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked up at her. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "how much time do you have this morning?" Clara thought of Poppy, back at the house with Martha. "She has time," she said. "And so do I. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." Mr. Poole looked at her for another long moment. as if he were weighing whether she was the kind of person who could hear what he had to say without going to pieces. Then he nodded, once, to himself, as if he had decided. Your great-grandfather, he said, was a man named Josiah Mercer. He opened the Apothecary in 1897, in a town that did not yet have a doctor closer than 25 miles. He was not a trained physician. In those days, many men were not. He had learned his trade from an uncle in Philadelphia, and he had come out here with his wife because land was cheap and because he believed, for reasons that were his own, that a small town in the mountains was the right place to raise a family. He opened the shop. He sold tinctures and ointments and patent medicines, the way every apothecary of the time did. But he was, from the beginning, a man with a particular kind of mind. He kept records. He kept records of every person who walked through that door, what ills they came in with, what he gave them, what they paid, and whether they recovered. Over the years, those records became something more than a ledger. They became a history. Everyone in this part of the county, for 3 generations, came through the Mercer Apothecary at some point. Everyone. The school teachers and the bankers and the mine foremen and the preachers and the sheriff and the people who married each other and the people who were sorry they had. Josiah wrote all of it down. And then his son, your grandfather's father, kept up the practice. And then your grandfather. Though by his time the apothecary was no longer the main source of medicine in the county, and the records he kept were more personal, more a matter of custom than necessity. Clara was listening. She was also, in the back of her mind, thinking about the receipts she had seen, the brief notations on the backs of cards. She will recover. He passed that winter, but comfortable. The child was saved. There is a second thing, Mr. Poole said. This is the part where you need to listen carefully. Josiah Mercer did not only practice apothecary. He was also, from about 1910 until his death in 1938, the unofficial pawnbroker of this corner of the county. He did not advertise it. He did not put a sign out. But when people needed money, in those years, before the banks came out this way, and even after, when people did not trust the banks, people came to Josiah. They brought him things. A gold locket, a wedding ring, a pocket watch that had belonged to a grandfather who had fought at Gettysburg, a handful of stones one of the mine foreman's sons brought back from a trip out west in the summer of 1915, which the foreman took to Josiah when his wife took sick and he needed money for a doctor in Roanoke. Josiah gave them a fair price, always. He wrote everything down. He held the things in trust. And if the people came back with the money, he gave the things back. And if they did not come back, and many of them did not, because times were hard and people died or moved or forgot, he kept the things. And he did not sell them, because Josiah Mercer was not a man who profited off the bad luck of his neighbors. He kept them. He put them away. And his son kept them. And your grandfather kept them. Clara's mouth had gone dry. The handful of stones, she said. The foreman's son. From out west. Mr. Poole looked at her with the steady, tired eyes of a man who had been holding a secret for a long time and was relieved, finally, to be letting it out. The foreman's son, he said, had gone out to Arkansas. He had worked for a summer in a diamond mine there. The family was proud of him for going. When he came home, he had a pouch of rough stones that the mine superintendent had given him as part of his wages, because wages were often paid that way in that time. The son gave them to his father for safekeeping. The father took them to Josiah Mercer in the fall of 1915 when the wife took sick. Josiah gave him $90 for the pouch, which was a great deal of money in 1915, and wrote him a receipt, and the father took the money and paid for the doctor, and the wife recovered, and the father never came back for the stones, because the $90 had been exactly what was needed, and he told himself the stones had been cursed, and he did not want them in his house. The stones stayed with Josiah. Josiah died in 1938. His son found them in the cabinet, read the receipt, and did not know what to do with them. He was not a rich man, your grandfather's father, but he was an honest one, and he thought, if I sell these, I am selling something that does not quite belong to me. He left them where they were. When he died in 1967, your grandfather found them. Your grandfather, Elias, came to me once, Ms. Mercer, around 1985, and he told me what he had. He had taken one of the stones, just one, down to a man he trusted in Richmond, a jeweler, and the jeweler had looked at it for a long time, and had told your grandfather, Mr. Mercer, this is a diamond, and it is a rough diamond, and it is a larger and finer stone than I have seen come out of any American mine in my lifetime. And if you have more like it, you should speak to a gemologist, not a jeweler. Your grandfather never did that. He brought the stone home. He put it back in the pouch. He put the pouch back under the false bottom of the drawer. He told me once, over a glass of whiskey at his kitchen table, that he had thought about selling them 100 times, but every time he went to do it, he thought about the Coulter boy, who was the foreman's son, and the Coulter boy was long dead by then. But his grandchildren still lived in the county, and your grandfather could not bring himself to convert something that had been given in trust into something he spent on himself. But he also, Mr. Poole said, did not know what to do with them. He had no children left. Your mother had, as you know, fallen out with him after your grandmother died. You were the last of the Mercers. And he told me, in that same conversation, that if you ever came to claim what he left you, you would have the right to decide. You, and no one else. That was why he hid them where he hid them, and why he wrote the letter the way he wrote it. Because he was not sure, until the end, whether you would come. Clara sat very still. She had, without realizing she was doing it, taken the velvet pouch out of her pocket and set it on the table between them. Mr. Poole looked at it. He did not touch it. He said, I have not seen them. Elias never showed them to me. I have only his word, and the word of the jeweler in Richmond, which your grandfather repeated to me a long time ago. But he was not a man who lied, your grandfather. If he said diamonds, they were diamonds. Clara pulled the drawstring open. She tipped the stones onto the table. 8 of them. They lay there, pale and cloudy, catching the light from the single bulb overhead, and flashing now and then with those small sudden fires she had seen in the shop. Mr. Poole looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then he said, very quietly, Oh my. Clara swallowed. How much do you think? She said. I mean, I know you are not a jeweler. But she could not finish the sentence. She did not have a shape for it in her mouth. Mr. Poole shook his head slowly. I am not a jeweler, he said. I am a postmaster. But I will tell you this. The smallest of those stones looks to me to be about the size of a pea, and the largest looks to me to be about the size of a pebble my grandson once brought home from a creek, which was, if I recall, the size of a marble. If those are diamonds, and if they are good diamonds, Ms. Mercer, then we are not talking about $8,000. We are not talking about $12,000. I do not know what we are talking about, but it is not those numbers. Clara put her hands flat on the table to steady them. Her fingertips, she saw, had gone slightly white. And Roy Bascomb, she said, why was he at my elbow before 9 in the morning with a lowball offer? Mr. Poole's face closed slightly, the way a careful man's face closes when he is choosing his words. Roy Bascomb, he said, owns the parcel of land behind your grandfather's building, yes. He also owns the feed store, and he is married to the county assessor's sister, and his nephew is the sheriff. His family has had an interest in that parcel and in the apothecary lot for a long time. Your grandfather did not sell to him, and did not sell to him, and did not sell to him, and Roy did not like that. I do not believe Roy Bascomb knows what is in that building. I would stake a good deal on that. But he has always believed your grandfather was hiding something, because that is how men like Roy think. Everything is a secret deal. Everything has an angle. If the diamonds were known about in this town, Ms. Mercer, you would know about it, because I would have known about it, because there are no secrets in Hollow Creek that 3 generations of Pooles have not heard. There are no diamonds in the rumor. Only suspicion. Only the sense that old Elias had something worth keeping, and that, now that he is gone, whatever it is might be easier to get at. Mr. Poole paused. He looked at the stones on the table. He looked at Clara. He said, Ms. Mercer, I am going to give you a piece of advice, and you are free to take it or leave it. You have a daughter. You came here on a bus with $39 to your name. You have just found out that you may be in possession of a thing that, if it is what we think it is going to change the way you live for the rest of your life. You are not, right now, in a state to make decisions about this. You are in a state to make mistakes. You need to do 3 things, in this order. You need to put those stones back somewhere safe. You need to eat a meal and sleep a night. And you need, first thing tomorrow morning, to find an independent appraiser, someone with no connection to this town. And you need to have those stones looked at by an expert, so that you know exactly what you are holding before you say one word about them to anyone, including Roy Bascomb, including Mr. Granger back in the city, including anyone. Do you have a way to get to a place where you can do that? Clara thought about her $23. She thought about Poppy. She thought about the bus schedule. She thought about the 3 days Mrs. Alvarez had given her that had turned into only the time she, Clara, could manage on her own, because Mrs. Alvarez had gone to Kentucky to sit with her grandson. No, she said. I do not. Mr. Poole nodded, slowly, as if this was what he had expected. He said, my cousin Alma lives in Roanoke. She is my mother's sister's daughter. She is retired from the trade. She worked for 31 years at a firm called Ashworth and Hale, which is one of the oldest gemological firms in the state of Virginia. She is also a woman who can keep a secret because she was raised in this town and she knows what I know about small-town talk. I will call her this afternoon, if you agree. And if she agrees, I will drive you and your daughter down to Roanoke tomorrow morning. It is a 3-hour drive. Alma will look at the stones. She will tell us the truth, and then we will know what we are looking at. Clara did not answer immediately. She looked at Mr. Poole, and she thought about everything her life had taught her about strangers who offered to help, and she thought about Mrs. Alvarez, who had handed her a cup of tea without asking for anything in return, and she thought about Martha Poole, who had fed Poppy sugar cookies, and she thought about the look on Roy Bascomb's face as he had leaned across his passenger seat. And she thought, for the first time in a long time, that it was possible, in this world, for people to be on your side without wanting anything from you. She had almost forgotten that was possible. She said, Mr. Poole, why are you doing this? Mr. Poole looked at his hands. Because your grandfather was my friend, he said. Because he came to me, twice a year, every year, for 19 years, and we sat on his back porch and we drank coffee and we talked about the town and about your mother and about you, though he had never met you, and about how the world was going. And because he trusted me with this, Ms. Mercer. He never told me where the stones were. He never told me how many there were. But he told me they existed, and he told me that if you ever came, I was to help you in whatever way you needed. He did not ask me to. He never asked anything of me. He simply told me, and I understood. I have been waiting for you to walk into this post office for 8 months, Ms. Mercer. I am glad you did. Clara put her hands over her face for a moment. Then she lowered them. All right, she said. Yes. Please call your cousin. Please. Mr. Poole stood up. He went to the telephone on the wall and dialed a number from memory. Clara slid the 8 stones carefully back into the pouch. She pulled the drawstring tight. She put the pouch back in her coat pocket, and she closed her hand around it. Mr. Poole spoke briefly into the phone, using the kind of language that communicated urgency without communicating content, and when he hung up, he turned to her and said, Alma will see us at 10 tomorrow morning. I will pick you and your daughter up at 7. Clara nodded. She could not speak for a moment. When she could, she said, Mr. Poole, I have to ask. Roy Bascomb said people are interested. He said not all of them are friendly. Who was he talking about? Mr. Poole sighed. He sat back down. Your grandfather, he said, owed certain small debts in this town toward the end. Not large ones. He lived carefully, but the roof on the apothecary needed work, and he could not do it himself anymore, and he borrowed from a man named Carver Dean to have it patched. $2,000. He was paying it back at $100 a month, and he had paid about a quarter of it when he died. Carver Dean is a hard man. He is not a bad man, but he is a hard one, and he is not going to let that debt slide, because a man like Carver Dean does not let debt slide. It is a matter of principle for him. He will come to find you, probably in the next day or two. He will want his money, and he will want the interest, and he will not be nasty about it, but he will not be friendly either. That is 1. 2 is the church. There is a pastor in this town, the Reverend Hull, who for a number of reasons of his own has been trying to acquire the apothecary building for about 10 years. He has a plan to open a food pantry in it, which is a good plan, or a community center, which is also a good plan, and he believed your grandfather was standing in the way of him helping people. The Reverend is a good man, but he is a persistent man, and he will come and talk to you with great sincerity about what the building could do for the town, and you will find it difficult to say no to him, because he is not wrong about what the town needs. That is 2. 3 is a man named Wade Gilchrist, who is the son of the man who ran the bank in Hollow Creek for 40 years, and who inherited, when the bank closed in 1998, most of the town's paper, meaning most of the old mortgages and liens and other claims that had never been fully resolved. Wade Gilchrist has convinced himself, on thin evidence, that there is an old lien on the apothecary property dating from the 1920s that was never properly discharged, and he has been arguing for 20 years that the property is legally his. He is almost certainly wrong, and your grandfather consulted 3 separate lawyers about this over the years, all of whom told him Gilchrist had no case. But Gilchrist will come to see you. He will be polite. He will hand you a folder of papers. He will tell you that if you sign over the deed, he will save you the cost of fighting him in court. You will want to throw the folder in his face. You must not. You must smile and take it and say you will consult your attorney. Do you understand? Clara nodded. Yes, she said. I understand. Mr. Poole looked at her with something close to pride. Your grandfather, he said, told me you would. He said, Edgar, my girl has been poor her whole life, and the one thing people who have been poor their whole lives learn, if they learn anything, is how to smile at a man who is trying to take from them. She will know. You just make sure she has something to eat, and a place to sleep, and the information she needs. She will do the rest. Clara laughed, a wet laugh, because her eyes had filled without her permission. Mr. Poole reached across the table and, for just a moment, placed one dry, warm hand over hers. Then he stood up, because he was not a man for long emotional moments, and he said, Come on, let us go get your girl. She will be wanting you by now. They walked back to the house together. The sky had clouded over while Clara had been inside the apothecary, and a thin cold rain was starting to fall, the kind of rain that meant business about turning into real rain by evening. The streets of Hollow Creek were as empty as they had been that morning, but Clara looked at them differently now. She looked at each storefront and she thought, who lives above that one? Who runs that one? Who knows my name? Who is waiting to see what I do? The town had become a place of faces she did not know but that knew her, or knew of her, and that changed everything about how she walked through it. Poppy was on the floor of the Poole's parlor when they came in, surrounded by a collection of wooden animals that Martha had apparently unearthed from somewhere in the attic. She looked up when Clara came in, and her face opened into the unguarded radiance that 7-year-old faces still have, and she said, Mama, look, Mrs. Martha gave me a horse and 2 sheep and a duck. And Clara crossed the room and knelt on the rug and gathered her daughter into her arms, and she held her for a long time, and Poppy did not complain, because even at 7 she had some understanding that her mother occasionally needed to hold her, and that this was one of the ways they took care of each other. Over lunch, which was soup and bread and more of Martha's impossible coffee, Clara told Poppy, carefully, that they were going to take a trip tomorrow with Mr. Poole to a city called Roanoke, and that it was for grown-up business, but there would be a long car ride and possibly a diner lunch. Poppy was pleased about the diner lunch and asked only one question, which was whether the diner would have pancakes. Mr. Poole assured her that the diner he had in mind would absolutely have pancakes, and Poppy considered the matter closed and returned to her horse and her sheep and her duck. That afternoon, Clara went back to the apothecary alone. She had told Mr. Poole she wanted to finish looking through the drawers, because she could not bear the idea of leaving them unexamined overnight. He had agreed, but he had also said, lock the door behind you, and if anyone knocks, you do not answer unless it is me. She had nodded. She had walked the 4 blocks with her head down against the rain, and she had let herself in, and she had gone back to the cabinet, and she had opened every one of the remaining drawers, one after another, methodically, with a small notebook she had borrowed from Martha, so she could write down what she found. 21 of the 48 drawers had false bottoms. Each false bottom hid something different. The pouch of stones had been the first, and it turned out also to be the last of the gem-grade stones, although 3 other drawers held rough-cut pieces of what she thought might be tourmaline and opal, pretty but probably not world-changing. The others held what her great-grandfather had pawned and her family had never sold. A gold pocket watch inscribed to a Confederate veteran on his 50th birthday by his daughters. A string of small natural pearls that looked, to Clara's untrained eye, like they had been strung about 100 years ago and had not been restrung since. 3 gold wedding bands, each with a name and date inscribed inside, dates that ranged from 1884 to 1923. A small leather-bound New Testament with a pressed flower between its pages and the name Cora Bell written in a child's hand on the flyleaf. A bundle of letters tied with a red ribbon that Clara did not read, because they were not hers to read. A silver baby rattle with the initials E.M. worn almost smooth. A pair of men's cufflinks set with small garnets. A cameo brooch of a woman's profile carved into pink shell. A snuff box, silver, with a family crest Clara did not recognize. A small ivory fan, yellowed, with a broken spoke. 2 old coins. One that looked to her as if it might be a Spanish piece of 8 and another that she could not identify at all. And at the bottom of the very last drawer, a small folded paper, which Clara opened carefully, and which turned out to be a piece of Mercer and Sons apothecary letterhead on which her grandfather had written, in the last weeks of his life, a single line. Clara, he had written, if you find this, you have found everything. Give back what you can. Keep what is yours. Love, your grandfather. She sat on the dusty floor behind the counter, surrounded by the open drawers, with the note in her hand, and she read it 3 times, and she understood, finally, what her grandfather had meant. The true inheritance was not the diamonds. The diamonds were a gift, yes, and they would change her life, and she had no illusion about the fact that she would accept them and use them. But the real inheritance was the book, the record, the knowledge of whose ring was whose pocket watch belonged to whose great-grandfather, whose letters had never been returned to the family they had been written to. Her great-grandfather had held these things in trust. Her grandfather had held them in trust. And now she was being asked, not in so many words, but in the only words her grandfather had found before he died, to decide how to hold them. Give back what you can. Keep what is yours. She closed her eyes. She felt something settle into place in her chest, some weight she had not known she was carrying. For the first time since she had walked down the courthouse steps in the rain with her bankruptcy papers, she felt that she had a piece of ground under her feet that was hers, that was not going to slide. She locked the cabinet. She put the key back inside the grandfather clock because she did not yet feel that she had the right to move it somewhere else. She locked the front door of the apothecary. She walked back through the rain to the Poole's house, and she had supper with her daughter and 2 old people she had known for less than a day, and she slept that night in the narrow bed with Poppy curled warm against her back, and she dreamed, for once, of nothing she could remember in the morning. Mr. Poole arrived at 7 in the morning, precisely as Clara had known he would. He drove an old sedan, a dark green Buick that had been cared for the way a man cares for a horse he intends to keep for life, and Poppy climbed into the back seat with her backpack and her horse, and her 2 sheep and her duck, and Clara sat in the front, and the stones, all 8 of them, were in the velvet pouch inside an inner pocket of her coat, which she had stitched shut that morning with a needle and thread Martha Poole had pressed into her hand without asking why. The drive to Roanoke took 3 hours and 15 minutes. It rained the first hour and cleared after that, and the roads wound through the rolling country in long, slow curves, and Poppy fell asleep against her stuffed elephant before they had been on the highway 30 minutes. Mr. Poole did not talk much. He was not a talkative man in the car, Clara learned, which suited her because she had a great deal to think about and did not want to have to carry a conversation. He had the radio tuned to a classical station, very low, and the music drifted through the car like a thin gray curtain. And Clara watched the countryside slide past her window and tried to decide what she would do first if the stones turned out to be what she hoped they were. The first thing, she had decided, was Poppy. The first thing was always going to be Poppy, the medicine that she could not afford. The doctor in the city who had told her 6 months ago that Poppy needed a specialist in pediatric pulmonology that Clara's insurance, such as it was, did not cover. The winter coat that Poppy had outgrown 2 sizes ago and was still wearing because Clara had let out the sleeves and the hem as far as they would go. The second thing was shelter. Not back in the city. She did not want to go back to the city. She had been thinking about this all morning, turning it over, and every time she turned it over she came back to the same feeling, which was that the city had been chewing on her for years and she was tired of being chewed. She wanted quiet. She wanted an old building with a pressed tin ceiling and a bay window and a small garden in the back. She wanted a town where Poppy could walk to school. She wanted the apothecary. That was the truth, though it had come to her only this morning, and she had not yet said it out loud to anyone. The third thing was the other families. That was going to be the slow work and the hard work, and she was already thinking about how to go about it. The receipts had names on them. Some of the names, Mr. Poole had told her, over coffee that morning, were still names that lived in the county. A Coulter, over in the next township. 3 Hollises, 2 Reynolds cousins. A Brown family that had become Brown with an E somewhere in the 1940s, but was still, recognizably, the same family. She could find them. She could knock on doors. She could not return everything to everyone, because more than a century had passed and many of the original owners were dead and gone and their descendants scattered. But she could try. She could try to find the people whose great-grandmother had worn this brooch, whose great-grandfather had read this New Testament, whose wedding ring this had been. She would not be rich if she did that. She would be less rich, certainly, than if she kept the lot and sold it at auction. But she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she would be able to sleep at night, and that there were not many things in this world that were worth more than the ability to sleep at night. They arrived in Roanoke at 20 minutes past 10, which meant they were 20 minutes late for the appointment. But Mr. Poole seemed unconcerned, and when they pulled up in front of a small brick row house on a quiet street off the main drag, and a gray-haired woman came out of the front door to meet them, Clara understood why. Alma was a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 70s with hair cut short and silver, and she was wearing a cardigan over a neat blouse, and she walked straight up to the passenger side of the car and looked in through the window at Clara and said, "You are Elias Mercer's granddaughter. I can see it in your jaw. Come inside. I have tea." The living room of Alma's house had been converted into a workspace at some point, with a long wooden table under the front window, a magnifying lamp clamped to one end of it, and a row of small wooden boxes along the back. She sat Clara and Poppy down, poured out tea for everyone, produced a plate of shortbread cookies for Poppy, and then sat down opposite Clara at the table and said, "Show me." Clara took out the pouch. She unstitched the inner pocket with a pair of small scissors Alma handed her, which was faster than the needlework had been, and she tipped the 8 stones out onto a square of black velvet that Alma had already laid out on the table. Alma did not make any sound. She did not react at all. She simply drew the magnifying lamp toward her, clicked it on, lifted a pair of fine tweezers from a tray beside her, and picked up the largest of the 8 stones. She turned it under the light. She turned it again. She reached for a small black device that Clara recognized from a documentary she had once watched on public television as a loop. She bent over the stone for almost a full minute without speaking. Then she set the stone down. She picked up another. She repeated the process. It took her the better part of 20 minutes to examine all 8. When she was finished, she set the tweezers down, and she clicked off the lamp, and she leaned back in her chair, and she looked at Clara across the table with the same sharp eye she had met her with at the car. "Ms. Mercer," she said, "I am going to speak plainly, because that is how I was raised. These are rough diamonds. All 8 of them. They are not the finest stones I have ever seen, because no rough stone is. They have to be cut and polished to show their true character. But these are good stones. They are clean, they are well-formed, and they are of a size that one does not, in my experience, see very often outside of industrial lots. The largest of them, the one with the good octahedral form, is a little over 3 carats in the rough. Cut properly, it might yield a polished stone of about 1.5 carats, which, in a diamond of this quality, is a significant stone. The smallest is about 3/4 of a carat in the rough and would yield something around 1/3 of a carat polished. Together, in rough form, what you have here is in the neighborhood of 15 carats. She paused. She took a sip of her tea. "I cannot give you a precise valuation," she said, "because that depends on the market and on who cuts them and on who buys them and on a dozen other factors. But I can tell you this. If you were to take these stones to a reputable dealer, one that I could introduce you to, and if you were to sell them properly, not hastily, not at a distress price, but properly, I would expect you to realize somewhere between $250,000 and $400,000, depending on the cutting and the market at the time of sale. Possibly more. I have seen the market do strange things in the last few years." She set her cup down. "Young woman," she said, "do you understand what I am saying to you?" Clara found that she could not speak. She nodded. She nodded again. Poppy, at the other end of the table, had picked up the smallest of the stones between 2 fingers and was holding it up to the light, and she said, "Mama, look, it sparkles." And Clara looked at her daughter, holding a pebble that Alma had just said was worth more than Clara had earned in the last 5 years of her life combined, and she pressed a hand over her mouth, and she began, finally, after 34 years of holding it in, to cry. They drove back to Hollow Creek in a different kind of silence than the one they had driven down in. Poppy slept for most of the ride, curled up on the back seat with her elephant under her cheek, and Mr. Poole did not turn on the radio, and Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap, and tried to understand that she was not the same person who had climbed into this car that morning. She had expected, on some level, that Alma would look at the stones and would smile kindly and would tell her that she had found a few $1,000s worth of nice, semi-precious materials, and that she had come 200 miles for a disappointment that was nevertheless better than going home empty-handed. She had not expected the words $250,000 to $400,000. Those words did not fit inside her chest. They rattled around in there like coins in a tin can, and every time she tried to hold them still, they slid sideways and landed somewhere new. Alma had given her a card and a name and a telephone number and detailed instructions. "You will not sell these yourself," Alma had said. "You will not take them to any jeweler in any town smaller than Philadelphia. You will make one telephone call in 3 days' time to this gentleman, whose name is Morris Ashworth, and who is the son of the man I worked for, and you will tell him that Alma sent you. He will make an appointment to see you in his office in Philadelphia. You will bring the stones. He will not buy them himself. He will introduce you to 3 different buyers, and he will oversee the process for a modest commission that will be, I assure you, the best money you will ever spend. You do not rush this, Ms. Mercer. You do not let anyone rush you. Is that clear?" It had been clear. Clara had written it down in the notebook Martha had given her 3 times, because she had not trusted her own handwriting. The first 2 attempts had come out jagged and unlike her. "Morris Ashworth, Philadelphia. Alma sent me. Do not rush." She had the card in her coat pocket. She had the pouch of stones in her other pocket, because Alma had told her to keep them on her person for the next 72 hours, and then to put them somewhere very safe, and to tell no one where that was except one trusted person, in case something happened to her. Something happened to her. Alma had said it the same way a person might say in case it rains. Clara had understood. She had nodded, and she had not asked what kind of something. They pulled up in front of the Pools' house a little after 4 in the afternoon, and Martha had the lights on in the kitchen and supper started, and Poppy woke up groggy and went inside to be given another round of sugar cookies, and Clara and Mr. Poole stood on the front walk for a moment before going in. Mr. Poole looked at her. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "you are going to have visitors. All 3 of them, possibly. Word has already gone around that you are in town. Carver Dean will come first, because he is an early riser and because he does not believe in letting a debt breathe. Reverend Hull will come mid-morning, because he does not believe in interrupting a breakfast. Wade Gilchrist will come in the afternoon, because he likes to come last, so that he can tell himself his offer is the one you are most likely to accept, since it is the freshest in your mind. Do you want me with you for any of it?" Clara thought about this. She thought about what her grandfather had written about her in his letter. The one thing people who have been poor their whole lives learn, if they learn anything, is how to smile at a man who is trying to take from them. She thought about her mother, who had smiled at landlords and creditors and doctors her entire adult life, and who had been, Clara realized now for the first time, one of the great quiet warriors of the world, for all the good it had done her in the end. "No," Clara said. "I do not think so, Mr. Poole. I think I need to meet them myself. But I would be grateful if you would stay at the post office and be reachable, in case I need you after." He nodded. "That is wise," he said. "You want them to see you alone, so they understand you are alone and capable. That is the right instinct." He paused. "But there is one thing I want you to have, Ms. Mercer, and you may say no if you like." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and took out a small handheld tape recorder, the kind Clara had not seen in years, with an actual cassette tape in it. "I carry this because I am a postmaster," he said, "and I deal with complaints about mail, and I have learned that it is very useful to have a record of what people say. I will lend it to you, and I will show you how it works, which is to press this button here. You will put it in the pocket of your coat. When each of these gentlemen comes to speak with you, you will turn it on before you open the door. You will not mention it. You will not show it to them. You will simply have it. And then, when this is all over, you and I will sit down together, and we will listen to what they said, and we will know. In my experience, Ms. Mercer, a man's word in a room where he thinks there is no record is a different thing than his word in a room where he knows there is. I do not want you to be alone in the first kind of room without a recording of what happens." Clara took the recorder. She held it in her hand. It was no bigger than a pack of playing cards. "Thank you," she said. "I will use it." "Good," he said. And then, without another word, he turned and went into the house, because Martha had opened the door and was calling them both in, and supper was ready, and Clara followed him, and she did not look back. That night Clara stayed up long past when Poppy had gone to sleep. She sat in the narrow back bedroom with a notebook on her knees, and she made a list, and then another list, and then a third. The first list was what she would say to Carver Dean. The second was what she would say to Reverend Hull. The third was what she would say to Wade Gilchrist. She wrote each list carefully, like a student preparing for an oral examination, because she was afraid that if she did not have the sentences ready she would fumble them, and she could not afford to fumble. She also made a fourth list, which was the names of the families on the receipts she had copied into her borrowed notebook from the false bottom drawers. Coulter, Hollis, Reynolds, Brown, Ingram, Watley, Devers, McLean. 23 names in all. 23 items she meant to try to return. She did not know yet how she would find all of them. She had time. She realized with a small shiver of disbelief, a great deal of time. Now, because she was not going to be evicted next week, and she was not going to have to sell the locket she had already sold, and she was not going to have to watch Poppy go without her medicine, and those three things alone were already more than she could hold in one evening. She slept a few hours. She woke at 5, because her body could not do anything else, and she dressed in the best of the two outfits she had brought with her, which was a dark blue dress with long sleeves that had been her mother's, and she went downstairs and sat at the pool's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and waited. Carver Dean knocked on the door of the apothecary at 7:42 in the morning. Clara had been at the apothecary since 6:30, sweeping dust from the front room with an old broom she had found in the back closet, because she had wanted to move through the space and feel it and be ready when the first knock came. She heard the knock. She wiped her hands on her apron. She pressed the button on the tape recorder in her pocket, and she opened the door. Carver Dean was a tall, thin man in his 60s with the long, weathered face of a man who had worked outside his whole life. He wore a canvas coat and heavy boots, and he held his hat in his hand, and he said, "Ms. Mercer, I am Carver Dean. I do not want to take up much of your time, but your grandfather owed me $1,500 on the day he died, and I believe that debt to be yours to settle now. I have the paperwork here, signed by him in my presence. I am not here to cause trouble. I am here because your grandfather and I made an agreement, and I mean to see it honored." Clara looked at him. She saw, with a clarity that surprised her, that he was exactly what Mr. Poole had said he was. Not a bad man. A hard one. The kind of man who would stand on a front step in the cold and ask for his money, not because he enjoyed it, but because he believed that the world worked because debts got paid. "Mr. Dean," she said, "please come in." He came in. He stood in the front of the shop with his hat still in his hand, and he did not sit, though she gestured to the stool behind the counter, because he was not the kind of man who sat down in another person's shop until the business was done. She asked to see the paperwork. He handed it to her. It was a simple handwritten note, signed by Elias Mercer in her grandfather's careful hand, dated 18 months before his death, acknowledging a loan of $2,000 for the repair of the roof of the apothecary, to be repaid at $100 per month until satisfied. On the back of the paper, in a different ink, her grandfather had noted each payment made, $500 in total, each entry signed with his initials and with Carver Dean's. The paper was honest. She could see that it was. "Mr. Dean," she said, "I will pay you in full. Today, by the end of the day. I will need a few hours. I will ask you to come back at 3 o'clock this afternoon. I will have it for you by then. I will also pay you $50 in interest, because my grandfather died owing, and that is a grief to a man like you, and I would like to close the matter properly. Will that be acceptable?" Carver Dean looked at her for a long moment. His face did not change much, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "that is more than fair. You do not owe me interest. Your grandfather died. That is not a circumstance a man charges interest for. But I accept your offer of payment in full, and I will come back at 3 o'clock, and I will bring the paper with me, and I will sign it over to you marked paid, and then this will be done. I am sorry for your loss, young lady." Elias was a man of his word. "I see you are also a woman of yours." He put his hat on. He left. Clara stood in the empty shop with the paper in her hand, and she thought, that is one done. She had no $1,500, of course. She had, at that moment, not quite $19 in her pocket. But she had understood, over the course of the night, that she had access to credit now that she had not had. 24 hours ago, because she could walk into any bank in Roanoke with Alma Poole's card in one hand and the pouch of stones in the other, and she could borrow, on security, more than enough to pay Carver Dean today and to keep her and Poppy alive for the 3 months it would take to arrange a proper sale with Morris Ashworth in Philadelphia. She had already telephoned Alma from the Poole's phone at 6 that morning, and Alma had given her the name of a loan officer in Roanoke whom Alma had known personally for 20 years, and Alma had said, "You will drive down this afternoon with Edgar. You will sit in Miss Holloway's office. You will leave one of the smaller stones with her as collateral, and she will give you a short-term loan of $8,000 at a reasonable rate, and that will tide you over until the sale is done." Clara had written it down. She was going to do it. She had 3 hours before she had to leave. Reverend Hull knocked at 9:45. He was a short, plump man in his 50s with a kind, earnest face and a nervous habit of pressing his hands together in front of his chest. He was exactly as Mr. Poole had described him, and Clara found, to her surprise, that she could not dislike him, even though he had come to try to talk her out of her building. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "I am the Reverend Amos Hull, and I pastor at the First Methodist Church 3 streets over, and I have been, for some years, interested in this building. May I come in?" Clara let him in. He stood in the front of the shop and he looked around, and his eyes took in the shelves of bottles and the old cash register and the worn wood floor, and Clara watched him take it in, and she could see, in his face, that he was not seeing the building she had come to love. He was seeing something else. He was seeing what the building could be. And what the building could be was, in his mind, a food pantry and a coat closet and a Sunday school annex, and a meeting room for the addiction recovery group that met in his basement and did not have enough chairs. He told her all of this. He told her honestly. He said, "Ms. Mercer, I do not believe in telling lies to people about their property. I want this building for the church. I want it for the town. Your grandfather and I had many conversations about it, and he always refused me, not unkindly, but firmly, and he had his reasons, which I respected even as I disagreed with him. I know you inherited a modest building and a small sum of money. I know you have no fortune to fall back on. I am prepared to offer you, on behalf of the church, $10,000, which is what we have raised over 3 years of specific fundraising for this purpose. It is every cent we have. I will not lie about that either. It is not as much as Roy Bascomb offered you, because I know about that. News travels. But it is what we have, and if you were willing to accept it, the building would be put to use in a way that would benefit this community for a very long time." Clara listened to all of it. When he was finished, she said, "Reverend Hull, thank you for your honesty. I am going to be honest with you in return. I am not going to sell you this building, but I am not going to sell it to Roy Bascomb either, or to anyone. I am going to keep it. I am going to move into the upstairs apartment with my daughter, and I am going to reopen the shop downstairs as something, I do not know yet what, but something useful. A small business. Possibly an herbal shop. Possibly something else. I am going to live here." She paused. She had not said any of that out loud to anyone, not even to Mr. Poole, though she suspected he had guessed. Saying it out loud made it real. "But Reverend Hull," she said, "I have something to propose to you, and I would like you to hear it out. I do not need every room in this building. The ground floor front is where I will have my shop. The upstairs apartment is where we will live. But there is a back room downstairs, behind the counter, which my grandfather used for storage, and which is about the size of a small church fellowship hall. It has its own back door onto the alley. It could be separated from the front of the shop entirely, with very little work. I would like to offer that room to your church at a rent of $1 a year for as long as I own this building, for use as your food pantry. I would ask only 2 things. The first is that you keep the food pantry open to anyone in need, regardless of whether they attend your church or any church. The second is that you let me help with it." Reverend Hull was a small, plump man with a kind, earnest face, and for a long moment he did not seem to be able to speak. Then he said, "Ms. Mercer, are you in earnest?" "Yes," she said, "I am." He pressed his hands together in front of his chest, and he pressed them hard, as if he were about to pray, and then he dropped them, and he took 3 steps toward her, and he stopped, because he remembered himself, and he said, "Young woman, your grandfather would have been proud of you today. I will accept your offer. I will accept it with my whole heart. I will have my deacons draw up a lease. $1 a year. I will pay you the first $1 today." He took out his wallet. He extracted a single dollar bill. He handed it to her with the gravity of a man signing a treaty. Clara took it. She smiled. She said, "Consider it signed." He shook her hand. He left. And Clara stood in the shop with the dollar in her palm, and she thought, "Two. That is two." Wade Gilchrist was in his 40s, and he drove a silver sedan too nice for the street he parked it on. He arrived at 2 in the afternoon, 55 minutes before Clara was planning to close the shop and drive to Roanoke with Mr. Poole, and he rang the bell 3 times before she let him in, because she wanted him to understand that his time was not hers to command. When she opened the door, he was standing on the step in a charcoal suit, holding a leather portfolio, and his expression was the professionally pleasant expression of a man who had been taught, somewhere along the line, that pleasantness was a tactic. "Ms. Mercer," he said. "Wade Gilchrist. I have been looking forward to meeting you. May I have a moment of your time?" She let him in. She did not offer him a seat. He took the portfolio under one arm and he walked around the front of the shop, slowly, as if he were measuring it, and he said, "Pleasant place. Pleasant bones. A lot of history here. I imagine you are finding it a bit much, all of this, being thrust upon you without warning." Clara did not answer. She waited. He turned to face her, and he set the portfolio on the counter, and he opened it, and he took out a thin stack of papers. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "I am going to be straightforward with you. I am aware that in matters of inheritance, particularly where elderly relatives are concerned, there can be complications. I have, in my possession, documentation dating from 1924 showing that this property was placed under a lien in favor of the Hollow Creek Merchants Bank, of which my father was, in his later years, the president, and which I inherited upon its dissolution in 1998. The lien was, as best as anyone can establish, never properly discharged. There are gaps in the county records. There are gaps in the bank's records. Your grandfather was, shall we say, not in a strong position to contest the matter, and I respected his age and chose not to press it during his lifetime. But the property has now passed to you, and the lien, I am afraid, must be addressed." He slid the papers toward her. Clara did not look at them. "Mr. Gilchrist," she said, "my grandfather consulted 3 attorneys about you, over a period of about 15 years. All 3 of them told him that your claim has no merit. He kept their letters. I have seen them. They are in the upstairs apartment, in the top drawer of the desk, which was the first place I looked when I arrived. I have not yet read them in detail, but I have read them enough to know that the county records are not, in fact, as gapped as you suggest, and that the bank's records were produced in full during your father's lifetime, and show the lien discharged in 1931. If you would like to pursue this matter through the courts, you are free to do so, and I will engage an attorney, and he will respond. But I want you to understand, before you decide how to spend your time, that I am not my grandfather, Mr. Gilchrist. I am a younger woman with more energy than he had, with fewer other problems pressing on her, and I am now in a position to say, the means to defend myself in court. I would encourage you to take your papers and to leave, and to not return to this building unless I invite you." Wade Gilchrist's pleasant expression held for a count of about 4 seconds after she finished speaking. Then it slid, very slightly, off his face, and what was underneath was not pleasant at all. He gathered up his papers. He put them back in the portfolio. He closed the portfolio with a small, careful click, and he looked at her, and he said, "You are very confident for a woman who arrived in this town on a Greyhound bus with a child and $39 to her name." Clara had expected something like this. She had rehearsed her answer the night before. "I am confident," she said, "because my grandfather raised me the way he raised me, even from a distance, and because I know what I am standing on. Good afternoon, Mr. Gilchrist." He left. The little brass bell over the door rang when he opened it and rang again when he closed it, and Clara stood in the silent shop and pressed her hand against the velvet pouch in her pocket, and she thought, 3. That is 3. And she clicked off the tape recorder, and she sat down hard on the stool behind the counter, because her knees had finally given out from 3 hours of holding herself up. She made the drive to Roanoke with Mr. Poole that afternoon. She sat in Miss Halloway's office for 45 minutes. She signed 3 pieces of paper. She left the smallest of the 8 stones in a numbered envelope in Miss Halloway's safe, and she walked out with a cashier's check for $8,000, and she cashed it at the bank branch, and she drove back with $1,500 in an envelope in her coat pocket for Carver Dean, and the rest in a second envelope for the weeks ahead. Carver Dean came to the apothecary at 3 that afternoon, as agreed. and she paid him $1,500 and the $50 of interest he had tried to refuse, and he signed the paper marked paid in full and handed it to her, and they shook hands. And before he left, he paused in the doorway, and he turned back, and he said, "Ms. Mercer, for what it is worth. This town is a hard town. It does not do kindness easily. But if you mean to stay, you tell anyone who gives you trouble that Carver Dean has your back. That will not stop all of it, but it will stop some of it." Clara thanked him. She closed the door behind him, and she sat down on the stool and she laughed, not bitterly, but with the tired, astonished laugh of a person who has just discovered that the world is capable of surprising her in directions she had forgotten existed. The weeks that followed were not easy, because nothing in Clara's life had ever been easy, but they were different, and the difference was the thing that took her the longest to adjust to. She and Poppy moved into the upstairs apartment on the first Monday of November. Clara scrubbed every surface and washed every window and beat every rug. And Martha Poole came over twice with the kind of domestic expertise that Clara had never had anyone teach her, and by the end of the first week the apartment smelled of lemon oil and fresh linen instead of dust and camphor, and Poppy had chosen the small back bedroom for her own because it had a window that looked out on a maple tree, and she had named the tree Gerald. The Diamonds went to Philadelphia in the second week. Clara drove down herself, on a one-way train ticket that she could now afford, and Mr. Morris Ashworth met her at the station in a gray coat that looked as if it had been tailored sometime before she was born, and he was exactly as courtly and exactly as professional as Alma had promised he would be. He took the stones. He gave her a receipt. He put her up in a small hotel for 3 nights at his firm's expense, and at the end of the 3 nights he brought her into his office, and he told her that 2 of the 3 buyers he had approached had made firm offers, and the higher of the 2 was for $367,000, and that he was recommending she accept it. She did. The papers were signed. A wire transfer was initiated. She rode the train back to Hollow Creek with a sum in her bank account that she could not, for the first 2 weeks, bring herself to look at, because every time she looked at it she thought the bank had made a mistake, and she was afraid that looking at it too often would make the mistake correct itself. She paid off Miss Halloway's loan. She bought Poppy a winter coat and a pair of boots, and a full round of the specialist treatment that the pediatric pulmonologist in Roanoke had recommended. She paid the back rent on the apartment in the city and formally terminated the lease, which gave the landlord a small dry pleasure and gave her an even smaller one, and she arranged for the few boxes of their belongings to be packed and shipped to Hollow Creek. She bought the locket back from the pawnshop on 7th Street, and she paid the pawnbroker the full interest he was owed, and she thanked him, because he had been fair with her, and she wore the locket from that day on, against her skin, under her clothes, where it belonged. And then, beginning in December, she did what she had told herself she would do. She took her borrowed notebook, and she started knocking on doors. The first family was the Coulters. There were 6 Coulter households still in the county, and she called on all of them, one at a time, and she explained who she was and what she had found, and she produced the receipt, and she showed them the pouch that had once held the stones. The head of the oldest of those households, a woman in her 80s named Judith Coulter, had turned out to be the granddaughter of the mine foreman, and she had sat at her kitchen table with her hand over her mouth while Clara explained the history, and then she had said, "My father never knew what happened to those stones. He thought his father had lost them in a card game. He told me that once, when I was a little girl, and he was angry about it, and he never brought it up again. He carried it as a shame. And your great-grandfather had them all along." She had laughed then, a high astonished laugh, and she had said, "Not shame. My father's inheritance was not shame. It was a kindness." Clara had not given the Coulter family one of the diamonds, because the diamonds were already sold by then, and because the Coulter family had been given, at the time, the $90 that had saved Judith's grandmother's life, which had been the thing they needed. But she had written Judith Coulter a check for $5,000, drawn from the proceeds of the sale, in honor of what her great-grandfather had held in trust for over 100 years. She had given Judith the original receipt, framed under glass, so that the story of the Coulter stones would no longer be a shame in that family, but would be the other thing it had always secretly been. She went through the rest of the names. It took her most of the next year. Some of the families she could not find, because the descendants had moved away or the line had died out, and in those cases she kept the items, held still in trust, in a new cabinet she had installed in the back of her shop, with the original receipts, waiting. Some of the families she found, and they wanted nothing to do with her, because they had forgotten the debts and did not wish to be reminded of their grandparents' poverty. And she let those people be, and she kept their items too. But most of the families, when she came, listened. Most of them cried. Most of them accepted back what had been theirs, and a small settlement besides. And they left her shop with something they had not had before, which was a piece of their own past that had been held safe for them by a man they had never met. The Hollis family, when she found them, turned out to be 3 sisters who lived in a farmhouse about 12 miles outside of town, the youngest of whom was 74. They had been looking for their grandmother's pearls for their entire lives, because their mother, before she died, had told them a story about how the pearls had gone missing in a time of trouble and had never been recovered. Clara brought the pearls to the farmhouse in a small box lined with cotton, and she laid the box on the kitchen table, and she opened it, and the oldest of the 3 sisters, whose name was Della, had put both her hands flat on the table to steady herself, and had said, oh, mother, we have you back." And the 3 old women had sat in the kitchen passing the strand of pearls between them, turning it this way and that in the afternoon light, and Clara had sat with them and drunk coffee and listened to them tell her about their mother, and about their grandmother before that, and about what the pearls had looked like hanging around a young woman's need to, because she was not, anymore, a woman who needed to get rich. She had enough. For the first time in her adult life, she had enough. The food pantry opened in the back room in February. Clara and Reverend Hull worked side by side to stock the shelves, and Martha Poole organized the volunteers, and by the middle of the first spring it was serving 60 families a week. When the pantry had been open for 6 months, the Reverend preached a sermon about it in which he said, without naming Clara, that sometimes God answers prayers through the hands of people who have not yet decided whether they believe in Him. And Clara, who was sitting in the back pew that Sunday, because Poppy had insisted they try the church the Reverend ran, cried quietly into the sleeve of her coat, and Poppy, without looking up, patted her mother's knee. Poppy thrived. That was, in the end, the thing that made everything else real. She started at the Hollow Creek Elementary School in January, and within a month she had 3 best friends and a part in the spring play, and her asthma, with the proper medication and the mountain air and the absence of the particular mold that had been living in the walls of their old city apartment, receded until it was only a thing that came up during certain pollen seasons and did not define her days. She named the black cat Clara had brought home from the pound after a week of searching for Soot, who was indeed, as the will had predicted, long gone. She named the new cat Sergeant, because she had read a book about a cat named Sergeant and she thought it was a fine name. And Sergeant slept at the foot of her bed every night, on top of the stuffed elephant, and Clara sometimes, in the evenings, stood in the doorway of Poppy's room and watched them both sleep and did not understand, in a good way, how she had gotten from the courthouse steps in the rain to this particular doorway. Mr. Granger, the attorney, came to visit in April. Clara had sent him a letter 2 months earlier, explaining briefly what she had found and what she had done, and he had written back expressing a careful professional pleasure and asking if he might come and see the shop. She had said yes. He arrived on a Saturday, wearing the same wire-rimmed glasses and the same careful mustache, and he walked through the ground floor of the Apothecary with his hands clasped behind his back and a small private smile on his face. And at the end he sat down at the small table in the back where Clara kept her teas, and she poured him a cup, and he said, "Ms. Mercer, your grandfather used to sit at this table with me when I would come up once a year to review his affairs. He would pour me a cup of tea, the same as this one, and he would say to me, 'Thaddeus, I have a granddaughter somewhere in the city, and she does not know I exist, and that is my own fault, and I have made my peace with it. But I am going to leave her everything, because if she ever comes to find me, even after I am gone, I want her to know that I was here, and that I was thinking of her.' I told him more than once that he should have written to you directly. He always said, 'No, Thaddeus. Pride is a thing you can put down in a letter, and I have got too much of it to put down.'" Mr. Granger lifted his cup. He drank. He said, "He was wrong about that, Ms. Mercer. But I do not think he was wrong about you. I am very glad to see what you have built here. I am very glad to have known him, and very glad, now, to know you." Clara did not trust her voice for a moment. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Granger. Will you stay for supper?" And he did. He stayed for supper, and he met Poppy, and Poppy asked him if he had known her great-grandfather, and Mr. Granger said yes, he had, and Poppy asked what her great-grandfather had been like, and Mr. Granger thought for a moment, and said, he was a quiet man who loved his family very much, even when he did not know how to say it, and Poppy nodded solemnly, as if this was something she already knew and was pleased to have confirmed, and she went back to her dinner. Clara thought about her grandfather often, in the years that followed. She thought about him most at the beginning of the evenings, when the last of the daylight was going and the lamps were not yet on, and the shop had the particular golden dimness that it took on in that single hour. She thought about him standing behind this same counter, writing out receipts in his spidery hand, and about his father before him, and about his grandfather before that. She thought about him sitting alone in the upstairs apartment, in the months and years after his wife had died, writing letters to her that he never sent, and writing riddles to a granddaughter he had never held. She thought about the 8 stones in the velvet pouch, and about how he had left them where they were for his whole life, because he had believed, against all ordinary sense, that someone would come, and that the waiting was worth it. She thought about this, and she thought about what it meant, and she did not reach a single tidy conclusion about it. She reached, instead, many small ones. That love, sometimes, does not look like what love is supposed to look like. That a man who could not show up could nevertheless prepare a place. That a granddaughter who had not been visited could nevertheless be remembered. That the true inheritance was not the diamonds, and not the building, and not even the receipts and the heirlooms she had returned one by one to the descendants of the families who had trusted her great-grandfather. The true inheritance was the shape of a life that had been held for her, in the dark, in a cabinet in a shop in a town she had never heard of, by a man who had loved her in the only way he had known how. On a warm afternoon, neck at a wedding in 1901, she had left the farmhouse with a jar of homemade preserves and a promise to come back in the spring, and she had kept the promise. The small leather-bound New Testament with the pressed flower between its pages had gone back to a young man named Thomas Whatley, who was a third-grade teacher in the next county, and who was the great-grandson of the Cora Bell whose name was written on the flyleaf in a child's hand. Thomas Whatley had opened the book at his kitchen table, and had turned the pages slowly, and had come to the pressed flower, which was a small blue violet, and he had stared at it for a long moment, and then he had said, "My grandmother used to talk about her mother picking violets in the spring. She said her mother loved them more than any other flower. I never knew where that came from. I thought it was just a thing my grandmother said." Clara had nodded. She had not spoken. Sometimes, she had learned, the best thing she could do was to carry the item to the door and to sit quietly at the table afterward and to let the descendants have the moment to themselves. The silver baby rattle with the initials E.M. worn almost smooth had been harder, because she had not at first been able to figure out whose initials those were, and she had spent several evenings at the County Historical Society with a stack of old ledgers and a cup of coffee that went cold 3 times, before she had finally traced the rattle back to a family named Easton whose son, Edward, had been born in 1912 and had died of diphtheria at 9 months old. The rattle, it turned out, had been pawned by Edward Easton's mother 6 weeks after his funeral, because the family had needed money for a headstone, and because she could not bear to keep the rattle in the house after he was gone. Edward's younger brother, born 2 years later and who had lived to be 91, had died in 2003, but his daughter still lived in the county, and Clara had brought her the rattle, and the daughter had held it in her palm, and had wept for the uncle she had never met, and had said, "I will give it to my own granddaughter. I will tell her the whole story. It will be in our family again." Each return took a morning, or an afternoon, or sometimes a whole day. Clara learned to bring the items in their original packaging, where she could find it, or in simple boxes lined with clean cotton, where she could not. She learned to carry the original receipt with her, in a folder, so that the descendants could see the date and the terms and the transaction in her great-grandfather's or her grandfather's own hand. She learned that some people needed to hear the whole story, and that some people needed to hear only the short version, and that she had to read each family as she walked through their door and decide which kind of telling they were. She was not a natural storyteller. She had not, in her life before this, been someone who sat in strangers' kitchens and explained things. But she became, over the course of that year, someone who could. The shop, meanwhile, was doing something Clara had not expected, which was that it was becoming a gathering place. People stopped in on their way home from the post office, or on their way to the feed store, not always to buy something, but often to sit for a moment on the stool by the counter and to talk. An elderly man named Rufus Bennings came in every Tuesday morning and bought a single bag of chamomile tea and stayed for 45 minutes telling Clara about his grandchildren, whom he did not see often enough. A woman named Janet Pryor, whose husband had died the previous summer, came in once a week to buy a candle, and sometimes she stayed to cry quietly at the small table by the window, and Clara learned not to interrupt her and not to offer platitudes, but simply to pour her a cup of tea and to sit across from her until she was ready to talk or to go home. The shop was making money, Clara saw after 6 months of keeping the books, which surprised her, because she had not really been trying to make money. But a shop that was a gathering place was also a shop that sold things, and a shop in a town where people trusted the owner was a shop whose owner did not have to work very hard to sell. Word spread. Of course it spread. You could not do what Clara was doing in a town the size of Hollow Creek without it spreading. And the word that spread was not the kind of word Roy Bascomb had tried to put about, which was that the Mercer woman was a city girl with her head full of ideas who would be gone by spring. The word that spread was that the Mercer woman was her grandfather's granddaughter, and her great-grandfather's great-granddaughter, and that she was keeping the old accounts in a way that very few people in this modern world would have thought to keep them. Roy Bascomb did not come back to the apothecary. Clara heard, from Mr. Poole, that he had told people in the feed store that he had no time for fairy tales, and that the building would come to him in the end because buildings like that always came to men like him. Clara did not comment. She had decided, early on, that she was not going to respond to Roy Bascomb publicly, because he was looking for a fight, and a fight would give him standing he did not otherwise have. She simply kept working. She opened the shop in the middle of January, with a small hand-painted sign above the door that read Mercer's Apothecary and Herbal, established 1897, reopened 2007. She sold dried herbs and teas and small honest remedies that she had learned to compound from her grandfather's books, and she sold candles and soaps and a few other things that Martha Poole had taught her to make, and she did not get rich from the shop, but she did not. In late May of that first year, Clara stood on the sidewalk in front of the shop, and she painted a new line onto the sign above the door. She had touched up the original lettering over the winter, because it had been cracked and fading, but she had not yet added the new line. It took her most of the afternoon, because she wanted the lettering to match her great-grandfather's as closely as she could manage. Poppy sat on the step and handed her brushes and offered commentary, and Martha Poole brought out lemonade in the middle of the work, and Mr. Poole came by at the end of the day to walk home with his wife, and stood on the sidewalk looking up at the sign, and nodded once, and said, "It looks right, Ms. Mercer. It looks exactly right." The sign, by the time Clara was finished, read as it had for 110 years, Mercer and Sons Apothecary, 1897, prescriptions carefully prepared. And below that, in smaller letters, a new line, which Clara had thought about for a long time before she painted it, and which was, in the end, the only line that had felt true. And daughters, it said, since 2007. She climbed down from the ladder. She stood back. She looked at the sign. Poppy leaned against her hip and looked up too, and said, "Mama, that is a good sign." And Clara said, "Yes, baby. Yes, it is." That evening, after supper, after Poppy had been read to and tucked in, after Sergeant the cat had been shooed off the kitchen counter for the third time and had retreated to Poppy's bed in dignified outrage, Clara went downstairs to the shop alone. She did not turn on the overhead lights. She lit one of the oil lamps her great-grandfather had kept on the counter for emergencies, and she sat on the stool behind the counter, and she opened the bottom drawer of the old desk that her grandfather had used, and she took out the notebook in which she kept the last of the names. There were 7 names left. 7 families she had not yet found, or had not yet been able to approach, because the descendants had moved too far, or the trail had gone cold, or the circumstances required a kind of delicacy she had not yet learned. She looked at the list for a long time. She was going to keep working at it. She was going to keep working at it for as many years as it took, because she had come to understand that this was the work of her life now, as much as the shop was, and as much as Poppy was. Her great-grandfather had held these things in trust for 110 years, and her grandfather had held them for another 40, and now it was her turn, and she did not know when her turn would end, but she knew she was not in a hurry to finish. Some trusts were not meant to be finished quickly. Some trusts were meant to be held, and to be handed on, and to be held again. She closed the notebook. She put it back in the drawer. She sat for a few more minutes in the lamplight, listening to the small sounds of the old building settling around her, the little creaks of wood and the soft tick of the grandfather clock upstairs, which she had finally wound and set going again 2 months after moving in, because her grandfather had always meant for it to run, and it had seemed wrong to leave it silent any longer. Then she blew out the lamp. She climbed the narrow stairs in the dark, because she knew them now, every worn board. She looked in on Poppy, who was asleep with Sergeant curled against her chest. She went to her own bed, and she pulled the quilt up to her chin, and she closed her eyes, and she thought, as she did every night now before sleep, "Thank you, grandfather. Thank you." She slept. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.